The chandeliers of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Great Hall were not merely sources of light. They were celestial bodies, vast and oppressive. Dripping crystals that seemed to weep onto the sea of black ties and couture gowns below. The air, thick with the mingling scents of Chanel No. 5 aged Scotch, and the metallic tang of ambition, was a suffocating opulence that Zaria Montgomery had learned to breathe as if it were oxygen. Tonight, it felt thinner than usual. She stood just off stage, a statuesque figure in a sapphire gown that clung to her form like a second skin. The fabric, a stark, cool island in the warm, glittering chaos. Her face, a mask of serene composure, betrayed none of the turbulence in her soul. To the hundreds of eyes upon her, the titans of industry, the political power brokers, the philanthropic elite of New York City, she was Zaria Montgomery, the brilliant public relations strategist, the architect of impossible corporate turnarounds, the woman who had single-handedly saved the Children's Global Health Initiative from a devastating smear campaign. Tonight, she was to be its savior and its saint, honored with the Foundation's prestigious Beacon of Hope Award. And now, boomed the voice of the presenter, a silver-haired senator whose smile was as polished as his Italian leather shoes. A woman whose integrity and vision have not only reshaped the landscape of corporate responsibility, but have given a voice to the voiceless. Please join me in welcoming Zaria Montgomery. A wave of applause, polite yet powerful, washed over her. She took a breath, the practiced, calming inhalation of a warrior before battle, and stepped into the spotlight. The light was warm on her skin, a familiar embrace. She walked to the podium, her steps measured, her smile genuine but guarded. Her eyes scanned the front row, a gallery of predatory smiles that never quite reached the eyes. And then her gaze landed on her. Eleanor Vance, seated at the center table, the undisputed queen of this gilded kingdom. Eleanor was the matriarch of the Vance family, the head of a corporate dynasty whose tentacles reached into every corner of American life. She was a vision in cream-colored silk, her silver hair styled in an impeccable chignon, a string of pearls resting on her collarbone like a delicate leash. She met Zaria's gaze and offered a smile of her own, a thin, bloodless curve of the lips that was both a benediction and a threat. Zaria's composure did not waver, but deep within her, a cold, familiar dread stirred. The Vances. It always came back to the Vances. She reached the podium, placing her hands lightly on its polished surface. The applause began to subside. "Thank you, Senator," she began, her voice smooth and clear, amplified throughout the cavernous hall. "To the board of the Children's Global Health Initiative, to my dedicated team, and to everyone here tonight who believes that compassion and commerce can." She never finished the sentence. "A moment, if you please." The voice, amplified by a microphone that had appeared as if by magic in her hand, belonged to Eleanor Vance. She had risen from her seat and was walking toward the stage with the unhurried grace of a woman who owned not just the room, but the very air within it. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. This was not on the program. Stagehands looked at each other, bewildered. The senator took a step forward, then stopped, clearly unwilling to challenge the matriarch. Eleanor reached the foot of the stage, her eyes fixed on Zaria. They were pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and just as cold. "Before we celebrate Miss Montgomery's achievements," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with a cloying sweetness that was more venomous than any shout, "I believe there are a few details the board, and indeed, all of you, should be made aware of." Suddenly, the massive screens behind the stage, which moments before had displayed the Foundation's logo, flickered to life. Zaria's blood ran cold. On the screens, in stark black and white, were documents, bank statements, encrypted emails, an internal memo. All of them were fakes, brilliant and insidious forgeries. But to the untrained eye, they were damning. They appeared to show Zaria embezzling funds from the very initiative she was being honored for, funneling money through a series of offshore accounts. A collective gasp swept through the hall. The polite applause curdled into a symphony of shocked whispers. Cameras flashed, the sound like a volley of gunfire. "It seems," Eleanor continued, her voice resonating with faux sorrow, "that Miss Montgomery's talents extend beyond public relations. It takes such courage, doesn't it, to build a life from the kind of history your family has? You must be exhausted from all the pretending." The veiled insult struck Zaria with the force of a physical blow. Your family's history. It was a direct, cruel, and perfectly calculated strike. In that instant, the glittering hall dissolved, and Zaria was a child again, standing in the doorway of her father's study. The room was dark, save for a single lamp casting a sickly yellow glow on the stacks of unpaid bills. Her father, Daniel Montgomery, a brilliant engineer with eyes that once held the fire of creation, sat slumped in his chair, a broken man. He had been a whistleblower, a man of integrity who had tried to expose a fatal design flaw in a hydroelectric dam built by Vance Industries. But the Vances, led by Eleanor's father, Marcus, had been masters of destruction. They hadn't just fired him. They had systematically dismantled his life. They fabricated evidence of his incompetence, accused him of industrial espionage, and buried him in lawsuits until every penny was gone. His reputation shattered, his spirit extinguished. He had died years later, not from any specific illness, but from the slow, creeping disease of a broken heart. Now, his daughter stood on a stage, under the glare of 1,000 lights, being broken in the exact same way, by the exact same family. The symmetry of it was breathtaking in its cruelty. The world expected her to crumble, to weep, to deny, to protest. But Zaria was not her father. She had been forged in the fire of his tragedy, and the steel of her will had been tempered by a grief so profound it had become a source of strength. She looked down from the podium at Eleanor Vance, her expression unnervingly calm, almost serene. The whispers in the hall died down, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. They were waiting for the collapse. Zaria leaned into the microphone. Her voice, when it came, was not a whisper, not a scream, but a quiet, clear note that cut through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. "Thank you, Eleanor," she said, her words precise and measured. "Thank you for that performance. It was truly captivating." She let the words hang in the air for a beat, a subtle reframing of the attack from a revelation to a mere spectacle. "Now, if you'll all excuse me," she continued, turning her back on Eleanor and addressing the stunned senator, "I believe I have an award to accept." She held out her hand. The silence in the hall was absolute, a thick, ringing void. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, as if breaking a spell, the senator stepped forward and placed the heavy, crystal award in her hand. Zaria gripped it, its weight a solid, grounding presence. She held it up, not in triumph, but in quiet defiance. She did not smile. She simply looked out at the sea of confused, shocked faces, her gaze unblinking, her resolve absolute. In that moment, she was not a victim. She was a declaration of war. The escape from the museum was a blur of flashbulbs and shouted questions. Zaria moved through the throng of reporters like a ghost, her security detail forming a tight wedge around her. She didn't hear their words. Is it true? Ms. Montgomery, do you have a comment? She only felt the percussive impact of their presence, a frantic, hungry energy trying to feed on her ruin. Her apartment, a minimalist sanctuary of steel, glass, and muted grays overlooking the East River, offered no immediate comfort. The silence that greeted her was louder than the cacophony she had left behind. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights a sprawling, indifferent galaxy below. For a long moment, she stood perfectly still, the crystal award still clutched in her hand. She could see her reflection in the dark glass, a woman in a sapphire gown, composed, elegant, unbreakable. It was a lie. With a cry that was more frustration than grief, she hurled the award against the wall. It didn't shatter. The heavy crystal struck the concrete with a dull, sickening thud and fell to the plush rug, dented but intact. The sound, however, broke something inside her. The mask of composure crumbled, and a single, hot tear traced a path down her cheek. She sank onto the sofa, the fine silk of her gown rustling in protest. The memories she had spent a lifetime trying to contain now flooded her, raw and unfiltered. She saw her father's hands, once steady enough to draft complex schematics, trembling as he tried to sign his bankruptcy papers. She heard her mother's quiet, desperate sobs in the night. She felt the shame of eviction notices, the pitying glances of neighbors, the slow, agonizing death of her family's dreams. Daniel Montgomery had been a good man. More than that, he had been a brilliant one. As chief engineer at Vance Industries' infrastructure division, he had discovered that the steel being used for the internal supports of the Oakwood Dam was substandard, prone to catastrophic failure under pressure. It was a cost-cutting measure implemented by a shady subsidiary, a shortcut that would save the company millions but could cost thousands of lives. Daniel had compiled a meticulous report and presented it directly to Marcus Vance. The response was not gratitude, but a cold, swift annihilation. Marcus, with Eleanor at his side even then, a chillingly proficient apprentice in the art of corporate brutality, turned Daniel's own report against him. They claimed he had falsified the data to extort the company. They produced forged documents showing he was in league with a competitor. They ruined him utterly. A public crucifixion designed to serve as a warning to any other employee who might develop a conscience. 2 years later, a section of the Oakwood Dam buckled during a spring flood. It didn't break completely, but the near disaster forced a quiet, billion-dollar retrofit. The Vances spun it as a proactive safety upgrade. Daniel Montgomery's name was never mentioned. He was a footnote, erased from history. Zariah wiped the tear from her face with the back of her hand, her movements suddenly fierce. This was not just a public humiliation. This was an echo, a pattern. Eleanor Vance wasn't just trying to destroy Zariah's career. She was trying to finish the job her father had started, to eradicate the last living legacy of the man who had dared to challenge them. A cold, hard clarity settled over her. Grief was a luxury. Despair was a surrender. She had spent 2 decades building a fortress around herself, constructing a life of success and influence so impregnable that no one could ever touch her the way they had touched her father. She had been naive. She had built a fortress, but the Vances owned the land it was built on. She stood up, her movements now sharp and purposeful. She walked to her desk, a sleek slab of obsidian, and powered on her encrypted laptop. The screen illuminated her face, casting it in a cool, determined light. This was not about defense anymore. This was not about clearing her name. That was their game, a game of reacting to their attacks, a game she could never win. This was about dismantling an empire. This was about justice. 20 years delayed. This was about revenge. Not the hot, chaotic rage she felt a moment ago, but something colder, more patient, more precise. She was going to use the skills they had forced her to learn, the mastery of perception, the strategic manipulation of information, the quiet, surgical application of pressure, and she was going to turn those weapons back on them. She would not just expose Eleanor Vance. She would unmake her. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, typing the first of many messages. The war had been declared on a public stage, but it would be won in the shadows. The first call Zarya made was to David Chen. He was more than a colleague. He was her digital ghost, a data analyst and cybersecurity expert whose genius was matched only by his loyalty. He picked up on the first ring, his voice tight with concern. "Zarya, I saw. I'm on my way." "Don't come here." "David," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "My building is a circus. We need a clean space. The old warehouse office. 1 hour. And David sweep the place twice. Assume we're already being listened to." The second call was harder. It was to Ben Carter, an investigative journalist whose reputation was a thing of legend in media circles. Ben was a bulldog, a Pulitzer Prize winner who had toppled senators and CEOs with his relentless pursuit of the truth. They had a history, a respectful, professional rivalry that had occasionally blossomed into grudging admiration. He was the only person in the media she trusted to see past the headlines to the machinery working beneath. Carter. His voice was gruff, sleep-addled. It was after 2 a.m. "Ben, it's Zarya Montgomery." A pause. "Figured I'd be hearing from you." Hell of a party. "I'm not calling for a quote, Ben. I'm calling because this is your kind of story. Deeper than you can possibly imagine. It's about Vance Industries." "Everything's about Vance Industries," he grumbled. "They're trying a hostile takeover of Omnigen Tech. That's the real story. You were just collateral damage to discredit Omnigen's defense team, which you were leading." "That's what Eleanor wants you to think," Zarya said. "This isn't about Omnigen. That's the pretext. This is personal. It goes back 20 years. It goes back to the Oakwood Dam." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Zarya knew she had him. The Oakwood Dam incident was one of those historical curiosities that had never been fully explained. A loose thread he had likely tugged on in the past. "Where and when?" he finally asked. "My associate will send you a secure location. Come alone. Bring your skepticism. I'll bring the truth." An hour later, in a sterile, rented office space inside a converted Brooklyn warehouse, the three of them convened. The room was bare except for a large conference table and a wall of monitors, currently displaying David's cascading lines of code as he performed a final security sweep. David Chen, small in stature with sharp, intelligent eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses, gave a final nod. "We're clean. No bugs, no trackers, no phantom Wi-Fi signals. For now." Ben Carter leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He was a man who looked perpetually rumpled, his trench coat a permanent fixture, his face a roadmap of late nights and too much coffee. "All right. Montgomery, I'm here. Impress me. Why would Eleanor Vance, one of the most powerful women in the world, risk a public spectacle like that over an old grudge?" Zarya began to talk. She didn't speak of her own humiliation. She spoke of her father. She laid out the story of Daniel Montgomery, the brilliant engineer, the man of principle. She described the faulty steel, the warnings ignored, and the systematic campaign of destruction that followed. She connected it to the present, to Eleanor's attack, framing it not as a corporate tactic, but as the continuation of a decades-long vendetta. "Eleanor isn't just trying to win a business deal," Zarya concluded, her voice low and intense. She's trying to erase a memory. My father's. And by extension, mine. Because we are the only living reminders of her family's original sin. Ben listened, his expression unreadable. He was a journalist, not a crusader. He dealt in facts, not feelings. It's a powerful story, Zarya. A tragic one. But it's just that a story. You have no proof. The records from that time are sealed tighter than a drum. Vance's lawyers made sure of that. That's where you're wrong, David interjected, swiveling in his chair. He brought up an image on the main screen. It was the forged bank statement from the gala. This is a work of art. The account numbers, the routing info, it's all cloned from a legitimate shell corp in the Caymans. But the artist got cocky. He zoomed in on a tiny digital artifact in the document's metadata. A faint watermark, invisible to the naked eye. This is a digital signature, a specific encryption algorithm used by a boutique firm in Zurich that specializes in reputational management. A firm that, according to 3 layers of shell corporations, is owned and controlled by Vance Industries. Ben leaned in. His journalistic instincts finally peaked. That's a link. It's not proof of the old story, but it proves Vance's team fabricated tonight's evidence. It's a start, Zarya said. It's the first thread. We pull on it, and we unravel everything. She looked from David's determined face to Ben's intrigued one. Her war council was small, but it was formidable. Eleanor attacked me in public because she thinks I'm weak, discredited, and alone. She expects me to issue a frantic denial. She expects me to hide. She paused, a predatory stillness coming over her. We're not going to do that. We're going to do the opposite. We're going to control the narrative. Tomorrow morning. Ben, you're going to get an exclusive interview. Ben raised an eyebrow. With who, your lawyer? With me, Zarya said, a faint, dangerous smile touching her lips for the first time that night. And I'm not going to deny a thing. I'm going to express my profound concern for Eleanor Vance. The interview was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Zarya chose a neutral setting, a quiet corner of the New York Public Library, and wore a simple, elegant gray dress. She looked not like a fallen executive, but like a concerned intellectual. Ben Carter, true to his profession, asked the hard questions. Ms. Montgomery, Eleanor Vance has accused you of embezzlement. The documents are compelling. How do you respond? Zarya didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a look of calm sincerity. I respond with sadness. Ben. Sadness for a woman who is clearly operating under immense pressure. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't attack. She sympathized. The hostile takeover of Omnigen is a high-stakes game. When people are desperate, they sometimes resort to desperate measures. I can only assume the evidence presented last night was the product of that desperation. She had skillfully shifted the frame. This was no longer about her guilt or innocence. It was about Eleanor's state of mind. Are you suggesting she fabricated the evidence Ben pressed? I am suggesting that we should look at the source of these allegations, Zarya said smoothly. This is a tactic, a classic and rather brutal move to distract from the real issues at play in the Omnigen deal. But it feels personal. It reminds me of the tactics used against my father years ago. She let that hang in the air. A breadcrumb for the curious. It's a tragic story. What happened to the Vance family back then? Around the time of the Oakwood Dam incident. So much loss on all sides. Perhaps some wounds never truly heal. She had done it. She had linked the present attack to the past tragedy, planting a seed of doubt, not about herself, but about Eleanor's motives. She painted herself as the calm, rational party, and Eleanor as an unstable aggressor, haunted by old ghosts. The interview went viral. The narrative, which had been a simple story of a corrupt PR guru, was now complicated, muddied. People started asking questions. What did happen at Oakwood Dam? Why would Eleanor Vance make it so personal? In the penthouse of Vance Tower, Eleanor watched the interview on a screen the size of a wall, her fingers gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles were white. Her face was a mask of cold fury. Zaria wasn't panicking. She wasn't denying. She was using Eleanor's own attack as a platform. "She's clever," her chief counsel said, standing nervously a few feet away. "She's her father's daughter," Eleanor hissed, her voice like splintering ice. "She thinks she can outmaneuver me. She thinks she can dredge up the past." Her eyes narrowed. "Leak the rest of the file. The documents about her father's instability. The sealed psychiatric evaluations. Let's see how composed she is when the world thinks her entire family is unreliable." Eleanor believed she was escalating the attack, but she was making a critical error. She was engaging on Zaria's terms. On the battlefield of the past, a battlefield Zaria was now meticulously preparing for a final, decisive confrontation. While the media landscape churned with speculation, Zaria, David, and Ben delved deeper. David's digital trail from the Zurich firm led them to a web of financial transactions. But it was all expertly anonymized, a labyrinth of digital ghosts. The physical records from the Oakwood Dam incident were even more impenetrable, buried under layers of legal seals and non-disclosure agreements. "We're hitting a wall of polished mahogany and high-priced lawyers," Ben said in frustration, tossing a file onto the table in their warehouse command center. "Every official channel is a dead end." "Then we stop using official channels," Zaria said. Her mind had already turned to another, more personal avenue. "There's someone who might know something. An old friend of my father's. His name is George Maxwell. He was a junior engineer at Vance back then, and he was the only one who stood by my father until the very end." The problem was, George had disappeared off the grid years ago, terrified of Vance retribution. Finding him would be like finding a needle in a continent-sized haystack. "Leave it to me," David said, his fingers already a blur on the keyboard. "People can run from the world, but they can't run from their data shadow." While David hunted for George Maxwell, Zaria made a trip that was both strategic and deeply painful. She drove 2 hours north of the city to her childhood home, which had been sold long ago to pay legal fees. Now, she was visiting the woman who lived next door for 30 years, Maria Robles. Maria, now in her 70s, with kind eyes and hands gnarled from a lifetime of gardening, welcomed Zaria with a tearful embrace. She had been a second mother to Zaria, a silent witness to the Montgomery family's destruction. They sat in Maria's cozy kitchen, the air filled with the scent of cinnamon and old memories. Zaria explained why she was there, what Eleanor had done, and her quest to find the truth. Maria listened, her expression growing fearful. "Zaria, child, you must be careful," she whispered, glancing nervously out the window as if a Vance limousine might materialize on her quiet suburban street. "Those people, they are poison. They destroyed your father." "I know, Maria, but I have to do this. For him," Zaria pleaded. "Did he ever talk to you about what really happened? Did he leave anything behind?" Maria hesitated, her loyalty warring with her fear. Finally, she sighed and shuffled into her small living room. From a dusty cedar chest in the corner, she pulled out a worn cardboard box. "Your mother gave this to me before they moved. She said Daniel wanted me to keep it safe. He said the world wasn't ready for what was inside. But maybe one day, it would be." Zaria's heart pounded in her chest as she opened the box. Inside, nestled amongst old family photos and her father's favorite vinyl records, were 3 thick, leather-bound journals, her father's engineering logs, and beneath them, a sealed manila envelope. She spent the rest of the day and half the night poring over the journals. They were filled with dense equations, structural analyses, and her father's elegant, precise handwriting. The early entries were full of hope and professional pride. But then the tone shifted. He wrote of his discovery of the substandard steel, his alarm, his meetings with superiors. He documented every conversation, every memo he sent, every dismissal he received. It was a meticulous record of a good man's descent into a corporate nightmare. Then she found it. A cryptic entry dated just 3 days before he was publicly fired. Met with MV today. Not at the office. A third party was present, his personal lawyer. An offer was made, not a bribe, but a cage. A gilded cage to protect my family. God help me. I don't know what to do. The truth must come out. But at what cost to them? There's a deeper rot here. It's not just the subsidiary. It's him. The whole thing is his. MV? Marcus Vance. A third party. A cage. What did it mean before she could process it? Her encrypted phone buzzed. It was David. I found him, he said, his voice triumphant. George Maxwell. He's living under an assumed name in a small town in rural Vermont. Runs an antique bookstore. I'm sending you the address. Zaria. Be careful. He didn't just retire. He ran. Eleanor Vance felt a flicker of unease. An unfamiliar sensation for a woman who lived her life in a state of absolute control. Zaria Montgomery was not behaving as predicted. The leaks about her father's supposed mental instability had backfired. Instead of discrediting Zaria, they had generated a wave of sympathy and renewed interest in the Oakwood Dam case. Zaria had become an underdog, a David fighting a corporate Goliath, and the media loved nothing more. Eleanor decided it was time to change the venue of the fight, to bring it back to her turf. She would summon Zaria to Vance Tower, a gleaming spear of black glass in the heart of Manhattan. It was an act of dominance, a queen summoning a troublesome courtier for a private execution. Zaria accepted the invitation without hesitation. She knew it was a trap, a stage for Eleanor to deliver threats veiled as conversation. But it was also an opportunity to look her enemy in the eye, to test the knowledge she had gleaned from her father's journals. The boardroom was on the 80th floor, a sterile, intimidating space with a panoramic view of the city. Eleanor sat at the head of a vast mahogany table, the polished surface reflecting her distorted, hostile face. She did not rise when Zaria entered. "Zaria," she began, her tone a perfect blend of condescension and feigned warmth. "Thank you for coming. I thought it was time we spoke, without the theatrics." "Theatrics are your specialty, Eleanor." "I'm merely an appreciative audience," Zaria replied, taking a seat opposite her, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady. Eleanor's smile tightened. "I worry about you. This obsession with the past. It's unhealthy. My father was a great man, a visionary. Your father was a troubled employee who made some unfortunate accusations. It's a sad story, but it's an old one. I am offering you a chance to let it go. Withdraw your implications. A generous severance package from your former firm can be arranged. You can disappear quietly. Start over somewhere new." It was a threat wrapped in the language of concern. Zaria recognized the tactic. It was the gilded cage her father had written about. "It's tempting," Zaria said, leaning forward slightly. "But my father taught me some valuable lessons. He was an engineer. You see? He believed in structural integrity. He believed that if a foundation is cracked, the entire edifice will eventually collapse, no matter how beautiful the facade. She paused, letting her words sink in. He also said the devil was in the details, especially the details of the subsidiary contracts. A lesson I never forgot. She saw it then. A flicker. A micro-expression of alarm in Eleanor's cold blue eyes, before it was instantly suppressed. Zarya had struck a nerve. The mention of the subsidiary contracts was a signal that she knew more than just the official story. Your father was a deluded man, Eleanor snapped, her composure cracking for the first time. Was he? Zarya countered, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Or was he just the first person to see the truth you've spent your entire life running from? Zarya stood up. Thank you for the offer, Eleanor. But I'm not interested in a cage. I'm interested in the truth. She walked out of the boardroom, leaving Eleanor Vance alone in her glass tower, the reflection of a powerful, unnerved woman staring back at her from the polished table. The hunter had just realized, with a chilling certainty, that she was also being hunted. The drive to Vermont was a journey back in time, through rolling hills painted with the fiery colors of autumn. The town was exactly as David had described: quaint, quiet, a place where people went to be forgotten. George Maxwell's bookstore, the printed page, was a cozy, cluttered haven, smelling of old paper and wood smoke. George was a thin, stooped man in his late 60s, with a halo of white hair and the haunted eyes of someone who had seen too much. When Zarya introduced herself, he visibly paled. He led her to a small back office and shut the door, his hands trembling. I knew this day would come, he said, his voice raspy with disuse. I always knew. I need your help. George, Zarya said gently, I have my father's journals. He wrote about a meeting with Marcus Vance, just before the end. He said a third party was there. George sank into a chair, his face ashen. It was me, he whispered. I was the third party. Marcus dragged me in. He wanted a witness. He wanted someone from Daniel's own team to see him break. The story poured out of him, a torrent of guilt and fear held back for 2 decades. Marcus Vance hadn't just rejected Daniel's report. He had presented Daniel with a horrifying truth. The subsidiary that supplied the faulty steel, a company called Keystone Materials, wasn't just a random contractor. It was secretly owned by Marcus Vance himself, through a labyrinth of shell companies. He had been defrauding his own company, cutting corners to line his own pockets, and endangering thousands of lives in the process. Your father had found the proof, George continued, his voice cracking. The real proof. Not just the bad steel, but the money trail leading directly to Marcus. He was going to expose him, not just as a negligent CEO, but as a criminal. That was when Marcus made his offer, the gilded cage. He presented Daniel with a non-disclosure agreement and a trust fund for Zarya. The deal was simple. Daniel would take the fall as a disgruntled, incompetent engineer, and in return, his family would be provided for. He would be ruined, but his wife and daughter would be safe. Marcus told him. George recalled, his eyes distant with horror, that, if he refused, he would not only destroy him professionally, but he would find a way to make it look like your father was in on the Keystone scheme. He would have sent him to prison. Your father was trapped. Suddenly, the vague clues from the journal and the family's history clicked into place, forming a picture of unimaginable evil. But the damn failing, Zarya began. That changed everything, George said. The partial collapse happened before your father could sign the NDA, before he could make his choice. It was a fluke of timing. Marcus used the near disaster as a smokescreen. He accelerated the plan, framed your father for everything, and buried his own crimes under the rubble of your father's reputation. He became the hero who fixed the dam, while Daniel became the villain who almost broke it. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. And Eleanor Zaria asked, "Did she know?" George shook his head sadly. "No. That's the most twisted part. Marcus was a monster, but he adored his daughter. He constructed an entirely different reality for her. He told her that your father, his trusted friend and colleague, had discovered a minor issue but tried to use it to blackmail him. He told her Daniel was the one who betrayed him. He raised her to believe the Montgomerys were the source of all their family's pain. Her entire life, her entire motivation. It's all been built on a lie, fabricated by her own father." Zaria felt the floor drop out from beneath her. This was never about corporate greed or a hostile takeover. It was a deeply personal vendetta, a daughter's lifelong quest to avenge a betrayal that had never happened. Her enemy wasn't a monster. Her enemy was a victim, a pawn in her own father's cruel, magnificent deception. And in that moment, Zaria understood that to win this war, she wouldn't just have to defeat Eleanor Vance. She would have to liberate her by destroying the very foundation of her identity. Armed with the full, devastating truth, Zaria's strategy shifted. This was no longer just about exposing a crime. It was about orchestrating a revelation. The upcoming Omnigen shareholder meeting, called to vote on the Vance's hostile takeover, was the perfect stage. It was a public forum, guaranteed to be live-streamed, attended by the press, industry titans, and federal regulators. It was Eleanor's moment of triumph, the culmination of her corporate ambitions. Zaria would turn it into her moment of reckoning. Despite being fired from the Omnigen defense team, Zaria used her knowledge of corporate bylaws to her advantage. She filed a formal request to address the shareholders, not as a representative of Omnigen, but as a private citizen with critical information pertaining to the ethical governance and undisclosed liabilities of the acquiring party, Vance Industries. To ensure her request wouldn't be buried, Ben Carter, working in concert with her, published a carefully worded article hinting at newly discovered irregularities surrounding the old Oakwood Dam affair and its potential financial implications for Vance Industries. He didn't reveal the whole story, just enough to pique the interest of the SEC and make it impossible for the board to deny Zaria's request without looking like they were hiding something. The stage was set. The night before the meeting, Zaria sat with David and Ben in the warehouse, the wall of monitors displaying financial charts, legal documents, and a live feed of the empty auditorium where the meeting would be held. "Are you ready for this?" Ben asked, his usual cynicism replaced by a quiet respect. "I was born ready for this," Zaria replied, though her stomach was a knot of anxiety. She wasn't just about to confront her nemesis. She was about to detonate a truth bomb that would shatter a woman's entire existence. There was no triumph in that, only a grim, necessary finality. She looked at the last piece of her puzzle, lying on the table before her. It was the manila envelope from her father's box. She hadn't opened it yet. She had a feeling she knew what was inside, and she knew she had to save it for the final act. The auditorium was a theater of sterile tension. The air was cold, the lighting unforgiving, the silence between speakers a weapon. Zaria sat in the front row, a solitary figure in a dark gray suit, a stark contrast to the Vance Industries entourage that occupied the entire center section. Eleanor sat at its head, radiating an aura of inevitable victory. She occasionally glanced at Zaria, a flicker of triumphant disdain in her eyes. She believed Zaria was there for one last, pathetic protest before the final gavel fell. After hours of procedural presentations, the chairman finally announced, "We will now hear from Ms. Zaria Montgomery." A murmur went through the crowd. Zaria walked to the podium, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. She didn't look at her notes. She looked directly at Eleanor. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm and steady. "I am not here today to talk about share prices or quarterly earnings. I am here to talk about foundations, the foundations of a company, the foundations of a family, and the foundations of a life." She started by telling a story, the story of two fathers, Marcus Vance and Daniel Montgomery, who were once colleagues, friends. She spoke of their shared ambition to build great things. Then, her tone shifted. She began to lay out the evidence, piece by meticulous piece. Using a simple slide presentation, she showed the tangled web of shell corporations that led from Vance Industries to Keystone Materials, and, from there, directly to a private trust controlled by Marcus Vance. She presented George Maxwell's sworn affidavit. With each new piece of evidence, the atmosphere in the room grew colder. The Vance lawyers whispered furiously. The board members shifted in their seats. Eleanor's face remained a frozen mask of composure, but a muscle in her jaw began to twitch. "This is slander," one of the Vance lawyers shouted, rising to his feet. "It is documented fact," Zaria countered, never taking her eyes off Eleanor. "Your founder, Marcus Vance, didn't just oversee the construction of a faulty dam. He personally profited from the fraud that made it faulty. My father discovered this. He wasn't a blackmailer or a traitor. He was a man who was about to expose a crime. And for that, Marcus Vance destroyed him and lied to everyone, including his own daughter." She let the accusation hang in the air, a poisoned dart aimed at the heart of Eleanor's identity. Eleanor finally rose, her voice trembling with rage. "This is a pathetic fantasy woven by the daughter of a failed, disgraced man. My father was a hero. He saved that company. He saved that town." "Is that what he told you?" Zaria asked, her voice softening with something that sounded almost like pity. "Did he tell you that before he destroyed my father?" He tried to buy his silence. This was the moment. Zaria reached down and picked up the sealed manila envelope. "I believe every story has more than one truth. The story my father's legacy tells is that of an unimpeachable hero. But that, too, is an incomplete story." Her hands were steady as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single, folded document. She placed it on the document projector. The text filled the screens behind her. It was a copy of the non-disclosure agreement Marcus Vance had offered her father, and at the bottom was a small addendum page, showing the wire transfer details for the trust fund, the Gilded Cage. It was a secret her father had taken to his grave, a secret that proved he was human. That for a fleeting moment, faced with an impossible choice. His fear for his family had made him consider the unthinkable compromise. The room was utterly silent. Zaria was faced with a choice that would define her. She could hide this detail, preserve the perfect memory of her sainted father, and win a clean victory based solely on Marcus Vance's evil. Or she could tell the whole, complicated, human truth. She looked at Eleanor, whose face was no longer a mask of fury, but of shattering confusion. The woman before her was not an enemy to be vanquished, but a victim of a lie she had dedicated her life to upholding. And the only way to free her was with the complete, unvarnished truth. Zaria took a deep breath. "My father wasn't a perfect hero," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she had not allowed herself to feel until now. "He was a good man who was put in an impossible position. He was scared. And your father, Eleanor, used that fear to try and control him, When that failed, he used it to destroy him and to hide a crime that cost lives and ruined families. He built his legacy, and your entire life, on a foundation of lies. The question for you, and for this board, is will you continue to build on it? It was over. The dual revelation of Marcus's profound criminality and Daniel's flawed humanity was a truth too powerful to be denied. It didn't just expose a corporate crime, it exposed the very soul of the Vance dynasty. Eleanor Vance stared at the screens, at the proof of her father's love and his monstrous deception, and something inside her finally, irrevocably, broke. She sank back into her chair, a woman whose entire world had just been erased. The hostile takeover vote was suspended indefinitely. Federal investigators, alerted by the live stream, were already on their way. The Vance empire, built on a cracked foundation, began to crumble. 6 months later, Zaria stood on a windswept hill overlooking the town of Oakwood. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and new beginnings. Below her lay the old, derelict factory of Keystone Materials, a rusting skeleton that had stood for 20 years as a monument to corruption and loss. The media frenzy had faded. Eleanor Vance, after a full public confession, had been stripped of her corporate titles and was now facing a litany of federal charges. In a move that shocked everyone, she had cooperated fully, using her remaining personal fortune to create a restitution fund for the families affected by her father's crimes, including the Montgomery estate. Zaria could have taken the money and walked away, her revenge complete. But revenge had been the catalyst, not the goal. The goal was justice, and justice was not about destruction, but about restoration. She stood now at a podium, not in a hostile boardroom, but in an open field, surrounded by the people of the town, former factory workers, local press, and a small group of engineering students. Ben Carter stood at the back of the crowd, a rare, genuine smile on his face. Today, we are not here to dwell on the sins of the past, Zaria said, her voice carrying on the wind. We are here to build a new future from its ashes. She announced the formation of the Montgomery Vance Foundation for Ethical Engineering, funded by the Vance Restitution Settlement and her own resources. The foundation's first project would be to tear down the old Keystone plant and build a state-of-the-art vocational training center and a new, clean manufacturing facility in its place. It was an act of healing, an acknowledgement of the complex, shared history of two families, honoring the good man her father was and the man Eleanor's father could have been. It was not about erasing the past, but about building a better legacy upon its complicated truths. After the ceremony, Zaria walked alone toward the site of the new construction. She held a set of architectural plans in her hand. The cycle of revenge was broken. She had not only reclaimed her father's name, but had transformed his tragedy into a source of renewal. She had faced the ghost of her past, not with hatred, but with a truth so powerful it had set both her and her enemy free. The wind picked up, rustling the blueprints in her hand, and for the first time in a very long time, it felt less like a storm and more like a promise.